They called her Doc. It was a term of respect in the special operations community, but when they said it to Hannah, it often came with a subtle, almost imperceptible condescension. She was a Navy corpsman, a combat medic, and at 5'4", she looked more like a college athlete than a warfighter. She was attached to a legendary SEAL team, a brotherhood of titans, men who were over 6 feet tall, built of muscle and grit, and had kill counts that would fill a small novel. To them, if she was their ticket to survival, their safety net, but not one of them. She was the woman they protected, the one they'd die to keep safe, a concept that chafed against Hannah's very soul. She had fought tooth and nail to be there. The physical and mental crucible of corpsman training was nothing compared to the icy reception she received in the teams. The men were polite, professional, and utterly dismissive of her capabilities beyond the medical. They'd let her practice tourniquets on them. But when they discussed tactics, breaching, or assault plans, their eyes would slide past her as if she were a piece of medical equipment. The team leader, a mountain of a man named Senior Chief Miller, was the worst. He was a ghost of the GWOT era, a living legend with eyes that looked like chips of gray ice. He never said a word against her, but his silence was louder than any insult. Hannah absorbed it all. She trained harder, ran farther, and lifted until her muscles screamed. She memorized every piece of medical literature she could, ensuring her knowledge was as sharp as the operator's blades. She knew that in their world, trust wasn't given. It was earned in blood and fire, and she was patient. Blood and fire would come. It came on a Tuesday. The mission was a high-value target snatch and grab in the eastern mountains of Afghanistan. The objective was a cave complex perched at nearly 4,800 meters. The air was thin, the terrain was brutal, and the intel was, and as always, sketchy. The team inserted via helicopter under a moonless sky, the rotors thumping like the heart of a beast. Hannah, loaded down with her medical pack and combat load, felt the familiar pre-mission calm settle over her. They moved up the mountain in single file, wraiths in the night. The silence was broken only by the crunch of their boots on shale and the harsh rasp of their breathing in the altitude. They were 2 hours into the ascent when the world exploded. It wasn't a complex ambush, just a single, perfectly placed pressure plate, IED. The point man, a young operator named Jonesy, stepped on it. The blast was a thunderclap that tore the night apart, a flash of orange and white that was immediately followed by the sickening chatter of AK-47s from the ridgeline above. They had walked into a kill zone. Chaos is a gentle word for what followed. The SEALs, trained to perfection, reacted instantly, returning fire and seeking cover. But Hannah's world narrowed to a single point: Jonesy. He was lying in the open, 20 meters ahead, a crumpled heap. Shouts of "Doc, Doc, we need you!" were drowned out by the roar of gunfire. Senior Chief Miller's voice cut through the din like a blade. "Suppressing fire! Covering position! Doc, stay down!" He wasn't ordering her to help. He was ordering her to stay safe. It was a protective instinct, a reflex. But Hannah wasn't there to be protected. She was there to fight and to save. Ignoring the command, she scrambled forward, keeping low, her heart hammering against her ribs. The world was a terrifying blur of snapping bullets and exploding rock. She reached Jonesy. The blast had shredded his lower leg. A femoral artery was nicked, and blood was pulsing out in a terrifying, rhythmic fountain. He was looking at her, his eyes wide with shock and pain. "Doc, I can't feel my leg." "You're gonna be fine, Jonesy," she said, her voice a calm island in the storm. Her hands, removing with a speed born of thousands of hours of practice, found the wound. She ripped open a tourniquet, slapped it high on his thigh, and cranked the windlass with all her strength. The bleeding didn't stop. She applied a second, then a third, higher up, each one a desperate gamble. The third one worked. The flow of blood slowed to a sickening ooze. She was injecting him with morphine and starting an IV when a sharp cry came from her left. Another SEAL, Petty Officer Evans, had been hit. A round had punched through his shoulder, shattering his clavicle and collapsing his lung. He was gasping, choking, his face turning a terrifying shade of blue. He was 15 meters away, pinned down by a heavy machine gun. For a moment, Hannah was frozen. 2 men down, separated, and under direct fire. The rational part of her brain screamed that it was impossible. But the medic's creed, the one she had tattooed on her soul, was stronger. She finished securing Jonesy's IV and told him to squeeze her hand if he understood. And then she moved. She low-crawled through the hail of bullets, the ground erupting around her. She reached Evans, who was struggling to breathe, his chest heaving uselessly. A tension pneumothorax. She didn't have time for finesse. She tore open his gear, felt for the rib space, and without hesitation slammed a large-bore needle into his chest. There was a hiss of escaping air, and Evans took a huge, gasping, beautiful breath. His color began to return. The firefight was intensifying. Miller and the remaining 2 operators were laying down a base of fire, but they were outnumbered and outflanked. They needed to move. They needed to get off the mountain. Miller's voice came over the radio, strained but controlled. "All teams, we are bugging out. We are moving to the extraction point. We have 2 wounded. I repeat, 2 wounded. Covering fire, and then on me." Hannah knew the exfiltration point was nearly a kilometer down the treacherous mountain. A kilometer of jagged rock, near vertical drops, and active enemy fire. There was no way a litter team could carry both men. They would be sitting ducks. The team would have to choose, and in the cold calculus of war, that choice might be Jonesy. He was the most critical. That's when Hannah looked at Miller, who had just slid into cover next to her, his face a mask of grim determination. "Oh, we can't carry them both, Senior Chief," she stated, not as a question, but as a tactical problem. "We take Evans," he said, his voice flat. "I'm sorry about Jonesy, Doc. We'll have to make him comfortable." "No," Hannah said. The word was simple, quiet, but it cut through the gunfire. Miller stared at her, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second. No one said no to Senior Chief Miller. Ever. "We're not leaving anyone," she said. "Give me 2 minutes." She didn't wait for his response. She scrambled back to Jonesy, then to a nearby rock formation. In her pack, she carried a space blanket and several hundred feet of tubular nylon webbing, a material strong enough to hold a truck. With trembling, blood-slicked fingers, she began to work. She tore the space blanket into strips, patting them against the webbing. She then created a crude harness, a simple loop system that could be worn like a backpack. It was an old mountaineering trick, a way to haul gear. But she was adapting it for a far more desperate purpose. She returned to Miller holding up the harness. "I can carry Jonesy. Evans can walk with help. We're a team. We move together." Miller looked from the crude harness in her hands to the bleeding man on the ground, then back to her. He saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. Not just courage, but an unshakable, absolute certainty. This wasn't a medic asking for permission. This was a warrior stating a fact. But he gave a single sharp nod. The next few hours would be seared into the memory of every man on that mountain. Hannah, with a strength no one knew she possessed, heaved the unconscious Jonesy onto her back. His full combat weight, gear and all, was nearly 200 pounds. Using the webbing harness, she distributed the load across her shoulders and hips. It felt like the weight of the world. The descent was a nightmare. Evans, his arm in a crude sling, he stumbled alongside another operator who helped him. Miller and the remaining man provided rear guard, their guns never silent. Hannah led the way, picking a path down the mountain. Every step was agony. The webbing cut into her shoulders. Her legs burned and quaked. The altitude stole her breath, leaving her gasping. Twice, she fell to one knee, the weight of Jonesy threatening to send them both tumbling down the mountainside. Each time she forced herself back up, or her vision tunneling to the next rock, the next safe step. She didn't just carry him physically, she carried him medically. At every short halt, while the SEALs laid down cover fire, she would gently lower him, check his tourniquets, monitor his vitals, and whisper reassurances to him, even though he was unconscious. Her hands never stopped moving, a constant dance of assessment and care. The SEALs watched her in stunned silence, and they saw the blood from her own shoulders seeping through her uniform, mixing with Jonesy's. They saw the way her legs shook under the impossible weight, and the way she stubbornly, impossibly refused to let it crush her. The shock on their faces slowly transformed into something else. Awe. Reverence. They had seen incredible acts of bravery, but this was something else entirely. This was a pure, undiluted act of sacrifice. Miller, watching her struggle up a steep incline, had felt a lump form in his throat, a feeling he hadn't experienced in 20 years of war. He had dismissed her as a liability, a piece of glass to be protected. She was proving to be the strongest steel among them. They descended for what felt like an eternity. The enemy fire finally died away as they dropped below the ridgeline, but the mountain itself continued its assault. They traversed a near-vertical scree field, and Hannah had to dig her boots in with every step, of fighting gravity and the shifting rocks. Jonesy groaned once, and she felt a surge of hope. He was still alive. Finally, after 5,000 meters of sheer hell, they saw the faint glow of the extraction zone. The helicopter was there, rotors turning, a beacon of salvation. As they stumbled onto the flat ground, the crew chiefs ran out to help. But when they tried to take Jonesy from Hannah's back, she snarled at them, a feral, protective sound. She carried him the last 50 meters herself, refusing to relinquish her burden until he was safely in the hands of the flight medic on board. Only then, when Jonesy was safely inside, strapped to a stretcher and receiving blood, did Hannah collapse. Her legs simply gave out, and she slumped against the helicopter's cold metal floor. Her body was racked with tremors. Her shoulders were raw and bleeding, and her hands were stained crimson. The SEALs gathered around her, their faces smeared with cam paint and exhaustion. But their eyes were clear. They didn't say anything for a long moment. They didn't know how. Finally, Senior Chief Miller knelt beside her. He looked at this small, battered woman, and then he did something no one had ever seen him do. He removed his own unit patch, the revered trident of a Navy SEAL, from his uniform. He reached over and pressed it into her blood-caked hand, closing her fingers around it. "We're not worthy of you, Doc," he said, his voice thick and hoarse, stripped of all its authority. It was just a man, speaking to the bravest person he had ever met. "You carried us all tonight." Hannah looked at the trident in her hand, then up at the faces of the men she had saved. They were no longer looking at a medic. They were looking at a legend. The silence in the helicopter was profound, broken only by the rhythmic thump of the rotors carrying them home, and the quiet, steady beep of the heart monitor connected to Jonesy, a sound that was, and thanks to the woman they had underestimated, still beating.